Hello, webinar attendees. My name is Marisol Morales, and I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership for Campus Compact. We're so happy to have you be part of our 9th Campus Compact National Webinar titled Census 2020 and Higher Education with our wonderful and talented presenters who I will be introducing shortly. I just wanted to say thank you for everyone who has signed up and participated in the first year of our national webinar series. We offered 9 webinars, and over the course of the year, we had 2,180 registrations representing 45 states and 9 countries. So we're really excited about the success of this national webinar series, and we'll be continuing it into next year. So in May, we will be releasing our calendar for next year's national webinar series, and you should expect to see about 12 to 13 webinars over the course of next academic year. In addition to that, I also want to plug our Compact Nation biweekly podcast series hosted by the President of Campus Compact, Andrew Seligson, Emily Shields, who is our Director of Iowa and Minnesota Campus Compact, and myself. Please check out our podcast. You won't want to miss it. And you can listen to it on any of your favorite listening apps. We have a lot of fun on there. In addition, I want to also just plug the save the date for the Campus Compact National Conference that will be taking place in Seattle, March 29th through April 1st, 2020. And the title of the conference is Full Participation, the Promise of Democracy, Opportunity, and Voice. And there'll be a lot of resources available. We plan to have that be our largest and most inclusive conference yet. And so you'll be seeing much more come out on that, as well as the call for proposals. But at this time, let me move on to our introductions. I'd like to first introduce Natalie Furlett, who is currently the Executive Director of Illinois Campus Compact, which is a partnership between 36 Illinois colleges and university campuses dedicated to upholding the public purposes of higher education. Prior to joining Illinois Campus Compact, Natalie spent time building student community ties at Northwestern University as the coordinator of student community service before taking the role as the Associate Director of the Norris Center for Student Involvement. Natalie holds an MBA in Nonprofit Management from the American Jewish University in Los Angeles, California, and a BA from the School of Public Administration at American University in Washington, D.C. Natalie currently serves on the Governor's Service Illinois Commission and on the board of for the Safe Haven Network. Next, I'd like to introduce Sherrie Taylor. She's with Northern Illinois University's Center for Governmental Studies Research. She's an associate and liaison to the State Data Center. She joined the Center for Governmental Studies full-time in April 2001 after working as a graduate assistant for 2 years. She works with the public and wide range of institutions in supplying data knowledge based primarily on public data provided by the state and federal agencies. As the project manager of the NIU role in the state data center network, she works with other agencies throughout the nation in helping others understand and utilize available data sets, as well as serves as Illinois State Liaison to the 2020 census count. And then finally, Dr. Robert Franco. Bob Franco is a cultural anthropologist focusing on Samoan Pacific Islander migration, diaspora, and adaptation. He directs the Office for Institutional Effectiveness at Kapiolani Community College, University of Hawaii. He tracks census and student achievement and engagement data and has effectively woven these into successful grant proposals to the Corporation for National Community Service, the U.S. Department of Education, HUD, and the National Science Foundation, as well as the Teagle and Keck Foundation. He oversees Kapiolani's Service and Sustainability Learning Program, and his campus will host the 2021 Western Region Continuums of Service Conference. So be sure to check out that conference when you all have a chance. And at this time, I'll turn it over to our presenters. Thank you so much for presenting on this important topic.
Thank you, Marisol. So first, I just want to start by saying that we have an hour, and we will not hit everything that we need to know about the census. But in this important month of April, where the census is a year away, we wanted to give a little bit of an introduction of why this is important and help you think about planning for the fall and then also for the actual count. So here's a little bit of our agenda. First, Sherrie's going to talk about sort of why the census is important, how the government uses this data, and sort of some of the resources with the Census Bureau. Bob's then going to talk about some of the specific issues that are of concern and has some great case studies to illustrate some of those ideas, including some campuses that are already working on this. And then I'll follow up with some resources and some other ideas of things that we can all do together for a fair and accurate count in 2020. So I'm going to hand it over to Sherrie right now so she can talk a little bit about the actual census.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sherrie Taylor. As they said, I'm working at the Northern Illinois University as the state interim lead right now for the State Data Center Network. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information as far as what that means, but the first burning question we need to address is, why is the census important and why should we all care? And what does this really mean to us? Well, I'm first going to refer to all of you as residents in the country, rather than higher ed at this point in time. And as you can see, the first reason we have there is constitutional requirement. The Census Bureau is constitutionally mandated to count every person in the country and the territories every 10 years. And this has been going on since 1790, so we have a little bit of history here. So as a result of that, we have all this information coming in every 10 years, and we call it the decennial census. Now, ever since then, we've had a lot of other surveys that have come into play, such as the Economic Census, the American Community Survey, stuff of that nature. But the most important is the 2020 census. The second reason why it is so important is because it has to do with funding allocation. So really, the bottom line is it boils down to power and money. The funding allocation is so critically important for us as residents because it translates into federal funding for our transportation networks, for our social services, for higher ed, financial aid. There's all kinds of programs that it filters into. And as you can see, there's 12 federal programs that constitute 70% of all the funding. Why is that so important? Because it all is based on the census count. And so the 2020 census is the baseline that is used as a benchmark for all the other census surveys. So it is really important that we get the word out to everybody in our neighborhoods to get the count out, make sure that it is fair and it is accurate. Now here in the state of Illinois, it's a little unique. We're one of the few states in the union that is actually losing population. We already know we're going to lose one seat in the House of Representatives. We could potentially lose a second seat in the House, and that's a big impact in our state. We've also quantified how much money it would translate if we miss people, and we figure that's going to cost about $18,000 per person. And so if you look at it every year, it's about $1,800 per year, but say we miss 20,000 people. We have about 13 million in Illinois. That translates to $360 million of lost revenue. Now that's got some teeth, that's gonna hurt. So we need to make sure we get the education out there to the folks. There's gonna be some that are gonna give a little pushback. That's okay, we have talking points to help you. So the other thing to consider, the 2020 census also impacts us for the next 10 years. So we need to get this right. We can't do a do-over. I'll give you an example. The university is actually housed in the city of DeKalb, Illinois. DeKalb, Illinois was not proactive prior to the 2010 census. And so they wound up having an undercount because they missed an entire development because they didn't update their boundaries. They had annexed that section, didn't let the Census Bureau know, so they were not included within the 2010 census count. They had to go in afterwards and do what's called a special census. A special census costs a lot of money. But they had to do it because over that 10-year period, it was going to translate to a lot more funding than what it would cost them to do a special census. So the goal this year is to be proactive, make sure everybody is aware of it, make sure the planning departments are on board, all of the regional planning commissions, all these different groups are on board, making sure all the information is accurate and correct prior to the 2020 census count so that we can make sure that everything is done properly right up front. Next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about the State Data Center Network and what that entails. This is actually a gift to all of you if you've never heard of it before. What happened, I'll give you a little bit of history on this. way back when. The Census Bureau was doing the decennial census, but people needed a way in order to access that information if they wanted to do some research. So what they wound up doing is creating this network throughout the country and in the territories, so that there were universities or state agencies that people could go to in order to take a look at the census data. Now today we have computers. You don't need to come to NIU in order to look at Illinois data. You can access it directly yourself. However, there are still a lot of questions as far as how to access the right information to answer your question, and then how to interpret that data. So these folks that are involved in the State Data Center Network are people that you can call. We usually do answer the phone directly. You will not get a robot. And we can answer those questions. And if we don't have the answer for you, we have a network that we can find the answer. And usually people can get their responses pretty quickly. So if you ever get frustrated with census data or with any other kind of publicly available data, you have a place that you can call and have your answers. We won't do your work for you, but we can certainly get you on the right path. There's usually no charge for services unless you ask for something additional other than just regular questions. The majority of us that are involved do not charge, or I'm sorry, we don't charge for the services. I forgot what else I was going to say, but anyway, it's usually free unless it's something additional beyond just answering questions. And a lot of us have been involved in this for many, many years, so there's a lot of knowledge there that you can tap into pretty quickly. If you ever want to contact anybody in the State Data Center Network, now there's folks in every single state. So you can just, if you don't take anything else away from this, just remember to Google State Data Center Network Census. And that will get you right to the page on the Census Bureau website that has a list of all the states and territories, and you can click on whichever one you want, and it'll get you right to those contacts. Okay, so on the State Data Center Network, what do we do? Well, we partner with the Census Bureau. We help them get boundaries updated. We help them to get building permit counts entered into their system, stuff of that nature, anything that may require contacts with local governments or agencies within our state. So that is our primary role. Any information that comes down from the U.S. Census Bureau is filtered to the State Data Center Network so that we can then disseminate it further. Now, I understand there may be some census employees on the call at this point in time that are partnership specialists. And right now for the Census 2020, they are very important. They are being busy going out and creating complete count committees, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, but they are really important as far as trying to network everybody within your states. So they're good people to know, but if you don't, it's okay. You can call your State Data Center Network representatives and they'll be able to tell you where to go. The next slide. So again, why should you care? Why is this important? It all boils down to money and power. It's really what it boils down to. And that's why we all need to be educated and be able to get the information out to everybody else in our communities so that they understand why the census needs to be responded to. Now, something new for this decennial count that we haven't been able to do in the past is being able to enter our information online. This is something new. They've been testing it, and so far so good. So it looks like we'll be able to do that. So that brings in some new challenges. How do we access online forms if you don't have access to a computer or perhaps can't afford internet access? We have answers for that. So for some resources, and we're going to be compiling a lot more resources as time goes on, but the Complete Count Commission is a commission that's in every single one of our states at this point. Every state is in like different methods right now as far as how they're organizing it and where they are in the process of organizing those commissions. But that is the central location for the U.S. Census Bureau to disseminate information specific to the 2020 census. So they will be doing marketing spots. The state of Illinois has already started to print a lot of brochures and passing those out. So various information is going to start coming down. I've heard there's even pencils available. So this is how you would gain access to all that marketing kind of information. Beyond the Complete Count Commission underneath that, that's what the partnership specialists come in. And they have been instrumental in creating these complete count committees. Now, a committee can be anything. It can be a student association. It can be a regional planning commission. It can be something that you create of just a bunch of communities that you think go together and work together real well. It doesn't matter. It's not bound by geography. It's not bound by people type in any way, shape, or form. So your imagination is the limit on what you can create here. The state of Illinois has actually an online form that if you want to create a complete count committee, you can fill out the form information and submit that. That way they have all the email addresses of all the people that they need to keep in contact with in order to let you know what's going on in your state. The American Library Association is really interesting. They were very instrumental in the 2010 census in making sure that there were places within libraries that people could go to get their questions answered as far as how to fill out the form. And so this time around, they're going to be instrumental in creating spaces with computers and internet access. So they are working to get funding from Congress right now. And they are hoping that they will have all that in place very soon so that they can start getting all the librarians trained on what they need to know in order to answer the questions if people come in to fill it out. And then you have the State Data Center Network. So if you get lost and you're not sure where to go or who to contact, you can just Google State Data Center Network Census. It'll get you to the main page, and then you'll have all the contact information for the people you need to call. We have to work real closely with the Complete Count Commission. We're trying to create these Complete Count committees now. The more the merrier, because the more communication we have in our states, the better it will be. Okay, next slide. So now we'll start talking about higher ed a little bit. So how do college students get counted? And this is something that can be really confusing sometimes, but the Census Bureau has it down to a science. So if you've never been involved in a decennial census before, it's okay, you're not alone. A lot of people are brand new to this, and it's kind of intimidating at first because we only have one shot at this, and that's it. Any do-overs are very expensive. So we need to get it right from the first start. So what happens is everybody is going to get a postcard sometime mid-March, late March, somewhere in that time frame that will give you information on how to fill out the form. Now, college students are a little bit different because they're in what's called group quarters, which is the same as folks that are in military barracks, perhaps nursing homes, some hospitals, prisons. Those are all considered group quarters. Those folks are all counted in the total population. So if you ever look at a region's population, everybody is included in there. But then below that, that's when they split off the group quarters. And group quarters can be any kind of a residence that has a separate kitchen area. Okay, so really you're looking at folks that are just staying in a bedroom. And so dorms are included within that. The Census Bureau is going to be needing to count all of those folks that are in those dorms, and they will be double checking with folks that are familiar with who is in those dorm rooms. Okay, so they don't just take the student's word for it, because we all know that when you have a child going to college, mommy and daddy are going to want to include little Johnny on their census form. It's just natural. So on this slide at the bottom, you can see it asks on the form whether or not any of those people are in any kind of group quarter housing. Okay, that's how the Census Bureau is able to then reconcile that information and accurately count where they are located. Because if the mom and dad put little Johnny on their form, then he's going to be assigned to that particular community rather than at the college or university. So it does make a difference. Now, off-campus counts can get a little contentious, because I know here at Northern Illinois University, the city is always concerned because when you have a bunch of students that live off campus, they're counted in the general population, which then brings down your household median income and stuff of that nature, making it look like it might be a depressed area. So we need to make sure that we get every single student counted and in that information, even though it may be a little bit contentious, and then educate those folks to say you cannot compare a university town to the next town, perhaps. We really need to compare university town against university town in order to get a little fairer comparison between the two. But that's always an interesting discussion with a lot of folks when it comes to campus housing and off-campus housing. So next slide, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Natalie to give you some real world examples as far as how this information can be used.
So I just wanted to use a couple of examples here from Illinois that I've been using to highlight for folks sort of the importance of this. One is something that Sherrie actually touched on a little bit. Western Illinois University is in Macomb, Illinois. Macomb has been losing population. Western Illinois University has been losing some enrollment. In 2010, they did not do a great count and a lot of the college students got missed. And so they ended up having to do a special assessment or a special census count a few years later to get their numbers up. And they worked specifically with the university because of the university's role in it. Northwestern University is a different example. In 2010, they made it a priority to get a good count of their students and to do an educational campaign so that students and parents understood. So they did the president put some money into it. They went door to door and explained to students how this worked. They had some funds that they did a little bit of competition. So if your dorm or if your fraternity filled out all the forms or whatever it was, they got, $200 for pizza or something to that effect. What that came out to was that Northwestern University had a 98% response rate, while the rest of Evanston only had a 74% response rate. And they calculated that that brought in over $4.3 million a year into the city in resources because the university had done such a good job. So I think it's important when thinking about this that there's a real economic powerhouse here that universities can do to help their communities. I also just wanted to say one other thing, which is that folks are supposed to be counted where they live on April 1st. So it does not matter. It doesn't matter if they live at home, 6 months of the year and they live in the dorm 6 months of the year. April 1st is the day they're supposed to be counted on. So this can get very confusing, for parents of, for children of divorce, where do they get counted? It is always where they live on April 1st. So that's really what we're trying to get folks to have information about. So now I'm going to hand it over to Bob to talk a little bit about why all of this is important and sort of what's at stake. All right, Bob should be here in a second.
Okay, there we go. Okay, hello everybody. Aloha from the islands. I hope you're thinking about questions you might have, and then you can send those in to us. We've been trying to create a kind of iterative process over the year and a half preceding the census implementation, thinking about what we can do in the summer and fall, and then thinking on to what we can do in the spring. So your questions will help us know what's still out there to be discovered. Sherrie and Natalie and I don't have all the answers, but we will answer those questions as best we can. Okay, so this what's at stake slide kind of goes over what Sherrie did earlier. For example, after 2010, there were 18 states that either gained or lost seats in the House of Representatives based on the U.S. Census. And of course, there's also issues around gerrymandering and things that people do with the census data, both Democrats and Republicans, in terms of how they establish districts and voting blocks for themselves. So there's a lot of power that goes on around this data. The 2020 data will be used for the whole decade to make these kinds of decisions about where power is sourced. Obviously, there's a lot of federal funding involved. Funds that go to states for Medicaid, food and housing, education, highway construction, and other things. Federal, state, and local governments use this for planning and programs, again, around transportation, education, healthcare, and housing. And I think we're probably going to see some sort of infrastructure funding in the decade of the 2020s, and that the amount of that funding may be linked or aligned with your census count and the number of people there. One step further, you may want to think about disaster relief and disaster preparedness and what kind of people are in your communities and what kind of disaster response planning you want to do with them. There's lots of research questions that universities can be involved with. And then, of course, private businesses and other organizations use the census data for planning where they should invest and locate. So there's a lot of both public and private interest in the data sets. Next, please. Okay, so I've been using, or I think it's useful to think of 2020 as a sort of metaphor for clear vision, right? We see in 2020, and these numbers help us sort of see more clearly out through the entire decade. There are some things that will fuzzy up this vision, and the first one, of course, is the question that is potentially going to be on the census around U.S. citizenship. Are you a U.S. citizen? It's suspected that this will result in undercounts of non-citizens and communities of color. I like that Sherrie focused so much on the concept of residence, using the concept of residence in this discussion rather than citizens and non-citizens. So the inclusion of this question problematizes the concept of citizenship, and I think residence is a much healthier way to think about who we're trying to count. We know that traditionally hard to count communities have increased in size over the decade. Non-English speakers, those with limited literacy, homeless, and others with unstable living arrangements. There's a lot, I think, distrust of government, and a lot of people have simply been displaced by natural disasters in Florida, Texas, Louisiana, Oregon. In a lot of states, there are people that aren't living at the same place they lived in 2010. So there's a lot of mobility here that might be difficult to reach through a high-tech census. This is the first high-tech census. Of course, as Sherrie mentioned, there's variations in access to broadband by ethnicity, income, education, and age. And it's a really useful Pew Foundation research study on these variations in access to broadband if you want to take a look at that. And then, of course, there's a question about privacy. How will the data be used, and how secure is it? And so these are just some of the things that will fuzzify our vision of the residents of the United States in 2020. Next, please. Okay, so here's the actual citizenship question as that's being debated, and we'll go to the Supreme Court, I think, on April 23rd. That's how the question currently looks. You could look at those and you maybe wonder, well, where does a permanent resident, what do they say? Do they simply say they're not a U.S. citizen? And so, anyway, that's the question that the Supreme Court will be taking up very soon as to whether this question had not been asked. You'll notice at the top it says citizenship asked since 1820, and there's a little footnote there. In actuality, it hasn't been asked since 1950, so there's a little misrepresentation there. Next. Okay, so in 1980, I worked to get Samoans and Pacific Islanders counted on the U.S. Census, and for 2 decades, I've worked with these communities using the census data. And it just seems to me that this idea that, okay, why don't we work with our communities of color now to make sure that they get an accurate count, but then there's a whole decade of interaction that then gets set up, how you work with them to use that data, to access funds, to create programs. So I think the census gets me, at least, and I think other demographers, into a kind of decade or decadal perspective about our partnerships with communities. So I think this is a really important kind of perspective to think about, okay, how do we establish, decade-long partnerships with our communities of color? How do we work with the census data and them to identify and fund the kinds of programs they need to advance and to achieve the American dream? Next. So this study was done based on the 2010 census. This is a nonprofit organization called Empowering Pacific Islander Communities. And again, I think this is something, maybe it's a community college thing, but this is something we really want to kind of work to build their capacity with us to address and develop funding for their programming and education and in health and employment, of course. So we have this effort around empowering Pacific Islander communities was really taken over by Native Hawaiian and Pacific leaders in the late 1990s and built on earlier census data. And they realized very early on that as small, marginalized communities, they need to do everything they could to get an accurate and fair count of how many of them were in the community, in the county, in the city. Anyway, so I think thinking of the census data as a point in time data capture moment, but how do you use that data first of all, and how do you help get an accurate count? But how do you then use that data to create a decade-long partnership or a 2-decade-long partnership with a community in your neck of the woods? Next. So from the census, they were able to promote a better understanding of the needs of this community. They were able to get critical, comparable and related data from other government and academic sources. So they were able to sort of move an agenda combining both census data and special studies that were done by academic departments at universities. And then this study actually disaggregates data on 20 different Native Hawaiian and Pacific Island groups. You could think of also sort of American tribal communities and the differentiation of their needs from place to place. Okay, next. And so the findings were that the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities were overly impacted by the recession. Remember the recession? And that they're still facing those economic challenges. The Native Hawaiian youth face challenges accessing higher education. So this is specifically about outreach to these communities to grow enrollment of different populations of underrepresented students from underserved communities, and that they're disproportionately impacted by disease and yet lack access to quality, culturally appropriate health care. So these are the kinds of messages that a small, empowered nonprofit organization has been able to develop and deliver based on their focusing on getting an authentic and accurate census count. Next. What we're doing here, and I think those previous slides were produced by Iosefa Aina, who is a civic engagement director at Pomona College in California, and he's also the head of that nonprofit, the Empowering Pacific Islander Communities nonprofit organization. So he's sort of that is like the perfect situatedness of somebody who's at a college and also has a nonprofit organization that wants to engage around the census and work with the university, its research capacities, its social welfare programs, its outreach efforts to improve opportunity for Pacific Islanders. So Iosefa really produced those slides for our presentation at the Continuums of Service Conference. What we're doing at Kapiolani is, and what Iosefa made a big point of, is that we can't simply run out to communities of color now and say we want to help. We need to try to do this on the basis of some trust that's already been established between the university and a particular community of color or underserved community or low-income community. So there may be people on your campuses that have those trust relationships with communities already. They might not be doing service learning, or they might be doing civic engagement work, but they have done something, say through social work or through the social sciences or the natural sciences. They have built these relationships of trust. So I would suggest that you try to identify them and really work through those networks of trust. Because these questions, particularly the citizenship question, I think are creating distrust. So I think we need to focus a lot, and Iosefa was very, very powerful and eloquent in saying we need to have these relationships of trust with these communities and then work from that. That I think is a very important point. we can't just run out suddenly and say we want to work with this community. We need to come from a foundation. Okay, so right now we're participating on the Hawaii Census Count Committee. And I'm participating with somebody from the University of Hawaii Office of Communications. We can see that there'll be some sort of standard public relations things that will come out of the University of Hawaii Office of Communications. There'll be banners up at the football games in the fall. There'll be, concerts and other kinds of things that the university is just going to do as part of their public relations work. So I would suggest you get together with your communications people and say, well, what are we going to do as a university, and how do we want to communicate to the public? And again, as Sherrie so eloquently mentioned, I think you need to connect with your census count committee and with your data centers and see how you can come up with some really good messaging about your work on the census. Our outreach coordinator is recruiting students. SSL is our Service and Sustainability Learning coordinator. She's recruiting students for student leadership and to apply for jobs with the census count. We're also engaging our workforce and career development people to be in position to hire students to do this work, as well as service learning students who will be broadly engaged. We're going to use Constitution Day, September 17th, to welcome people to campus and to talk about how the census is positioned in the Constitution and why it's so important. And then we're hoping to develop a census toolkit that we'll probably do in collaboration with Illinois Campus Compact and with the national office and with whoever else is interested. So next slide. Okay, so real quickly, Dominican University, which is a private liberal arts university in Northern Illinois and Kapi'olani are public. So I thought I'd just inject the idea that, institutional type might influence what you do in this area. Dominican is a Catholic university, and their goal is to support full participation of hard to count communities. So this notion of hard to count is another thing that you can Google. You can Google hard to count, and it will take you to your state, and it will show you different parts of your state that had low response rates on the mailed census form in 2010. And so you can figure out who your hard to count communities are really quickly going to that site. Now, Julia Vanderin at Dominican, she has already really gotten out of the gate on this work. If you can move to the next slide. She's got low response scores for Marin County, which is where Dominican is located. And you can see that there are certain census subtracts, where response rates are very low. Those are the ones in the red and orange. And so this kind of precision enables people to figure out, well, how do we reach those communities? And how do we make sure they know that they need to be online? And what's the library they would need to go to respond to the census? So a lot of networking, but I think this hard to count concept is a really helpful one. And the Census Bureau has done a really great job in making that data available to us. And you can see where geography, political science, there's a lot of disciplines that could be brought into to this effort. So next. Okay, so Dominican's the only university in Marin County. They have an obligation to educate the community about important issues. They see themselves as having expertise that can be helpful to the community. It's an opportunity for students, faculty, and staff to engage with the community and to learn about vital issues. And then there's a whole promoting of student development of leadership and civic skills. So I think Dominican has kind of figured out the languaging, the framing and naming around this work. And I think, and then their partner, who Julia wanted me to make sure I recognized, was Canal Alliance, because they're producing all these things, all this information in Spanish for those hard to count communities. Next. I think you're on, Natalie, now.
I am.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about a couple of things that we're thinking about here in Illinois and how we're framing this for ourselves. And I know we had at least one question, so that Sherrie was going to tackle in a minute. So I'll spend another maybe 5 minutes talking about this, and then we'll open up to questions for the last 10, 15 minutes. So the way Illinois is looking at this is sort of a threefold approach, right? So the things that both Bob and Sherrie have talked about, working with students on and off campus. So how do we make sure that we're educating our students? How do we make sure that we're letting folks know if they're in the dorms, if they're not in the dorms, how they're counted, educating parents as to what their responsibility is. We had someone from the Illinois Secretary of State's office talking with us, and as Sherrie pointed out, the Census Bureau is on top of making sure that there's not an overcount with students, because that's always a concern. But, we'd rather have the student be counted on campus, the parent fill it out and count them, but fill out that little box that says they live somewhere else seasonally, and then let the Census Bureau figure it out, because it's more important that they be counted than for them to not be counted. So, we're thinking about it that way. We're thinking about it with partners in the community. So as Bob was talking about, while higher ed has lots of expertise to add to folks, we are not always the trusted partner that is going to be listened to in the community. And so we need to be finding those people, those community partners who are already doing this work and really offering our assistance in ways that they need it. That's why those complete count committees are really important. There's already over 1,600 complete count committees across the United States. I think in Illinois, the number is about 170. And those can be run by local governments. They can be run by the library. They can be run by lots of different folks. So there's lots of opportunities there. And most of those complete count committees are looking for higher ed folks to be a part of it, because they know that this is a difficult population to count, but they also want to use our students for support and all of these other opportunities to get students out there. And then the last piece we're looking at is the civic education piece and K through 12. So someone as young as 15 can fill out the census information for their household. So the idea is that there is a really great opportunity for civic education and learning with our high school partners. But then in addition, when you think about hard to count communities, communities where English is not their first language, for some of those populations, the only government entity that they have a trusted relationship is with their kids' school. And so how do we help those schools get out good messages, right? So if we already have students that are working in schools, how can they be messengers for the census and also support to help folks with the census? So we're partnering with different folks here in Illinois to have that conversation. So here's just some of the ideas of like who, talking about how you clarify the roles on campus, right? So like, what are different folks doing? How are they reaching out? If you're part of a complete count committee in your area, who's doing that from the campus and how are they reporting back to the folks on campus? Because there's tons of folks that are important partners in this, and we want to make sure that everyone's having an opportunity to be part of the conversation. So this slide I actually stole from our partners in Minnesota, who are doing some really, really great work on this as well. But, one of the things that they kind of were laying out for folks is, what are the issues and how can higher ed help? So, if people don't know why it's important, what kind of educational exercises can universities use to help reinforce the importance of the census? There's a big issue of distrust, as Bob was talking about, specifically because of the media coverage of this citizenship question. So who are our students who could be trusted messengers in their communities that can help in those hard to count communities, particularly in where community colleges are, where those students are of the community, and how can they participate and help to support getting this message out? Staffing, as Bob talked about, how do we get our students to take some of these 2020 jobs, because they're going to be really amazing civic engagement opportunities and learning opportunities. Training, so we're working with some local nonprofits here in Illinois to create some community organizing trainings that we can use on campuses so that students and faculty and staff can learn sort of how to have these conversations about the census. And then again, raising awareness with campus systems and students off campus and how all of that works. So Campus Compact is working really hard to create some resources. Here I've added my website because I've got some of those resources up there, but we're working with a group of folks, as Bob recognized, to create some some more national resources that are available, and also to have some sort of toolkit that'll help you plan for your campus. So some of the links on my website are federal links. There are some really, really great resources on there. So, you know, like there's Faith in Public Service has created a toolkit for faith communities to do this work. Asian Americans Advancing Justice have a really amazing list of opportunities. There's a nonprofit here in Illinois called Forefront that is the nonprofit and funders collaborative, and they've created some really, really great one sheets that'll help folks to understand the issues behind the census and why it's important. So, you know, we're putting some resources into this because we know it's important, but also because the opportunities here for civic learning, civic engagement, and really kind of connecting folks with this 2020 census and how that will affect elections moving forward, since we all do so much work on getting out the vote. This is similar work. This is getting out the count, and how do we do that better together? So those are sort of the slides that we put together. I know there was at least one question, and Sherrie wanted to tackle that one. So I don't know if Bob and Sherrie want to come back, and if there's more questions that folks have, if you want to put that in the Q&A, and we can start to address some of those. Sherrie, did you want to address the timeline?
Sure. The Census 2020 is based on what happens on April 1st of 2020. So if your student is still in college at that point, even if they're on spring break, they're still to be counted on campus. So it's wherever you are residing and what you are doing that day. As far as the second part of her question was, how does summer impact the counting? And it really doesn't, because it should be in everybody's spring semester. However, if you need to do a special census, like I mentioned with the city of DeKalb here at Northern Illinois University, they did the special census in the summer, which created a whole new challenge because all the students had left for the summer. So they had to really try to backtrack and try to figure out how to get that information together at that point. So it's just another reason why you need to be so proactive, get the network established, start talking to people, call your local library, make sure that they are dialed in with the American Library Association, you know, and are familiar with the different activities that they're putting together. It's really important that everybody do their share in order to get this percolated through all of our communities.
So someone else just asked a question about how long is the census open and when would you suggest starting to market to students? So the Census Bureau is going to start doing some of their marketing and advertising, I think, as early as January of 2020, letting folks know that it's coming, giving folks information about how they're going to fill it out. You know, they are teaching folks how to use this online because nobody's done that before, but also, you know, there's a whole generation of folks who haven't ever filled out their own census information that will be participating. So they're going to do a ton of advertising on that. The big push is then they send out these postcards in mid to sometime in March, where every household gets a postcard. They can go online. It's got a little, you know, personalized tag that they fill in, and then they have to fill out the information. And then it's open. It's open, I think, until June, but like the information is, they're hoping to get everything in April, and then starting in May is when they start sending people door to door to knock and say, you know, you haven't filled out your information and we need this info. A couple of questions that have come up around that is, one, can you fill out part and not all of the census? The answer is technically yes, but if you do that, then that doesn't mean that people won't show up at your door and want the rest of the information. So that's an important piece to remember. So for a lot of folks, when we specifically think about the citizenship question, the big fear is having the government come and knock on your door. If they fill out this information and fill out the census form completely, most likely they won't have someone knock on their door. If they don't fill out the census form at all, or they don't fill it out completely, then they will. So that part is continuing to happen. And so, Sherrie, do you know when they finalize the census data then? Because that's the only part I'm not remembering.
What I do know, I don't know exactly when the data will be released. I didn't actually look it up, but I know it won't be until sometime in the middle of 2021. And there are other processes that take place. And once that information comes in, then that's when they start the gerrymandering, all of that kind of information. So the information doesn't just get released because they have a lot of aggregations to do, and then they have new boundaries to deal with after the count. So there's going to be information kind of trickling out throughout 2021.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
when I helped get the Pacific Islanders on the 1980 census, I came to Hawaii to work at the East West Center because they were bringing together graduate students around the 1980 census. So they wanted to have graduate students in place for when the data rolled out. So if you were to think a little more, like I tried to say before, about beginning the conversation now with community partners, and then thinking about a research agenda moving forward, internships, what roles could students play in research, particularly graduate assistants. You'd probably want to plan that out for fall of 20 or probably 2022. You'd want to have the research model kind of in place by then, and how you were going to conduct this. So I just want to continue to emphasize the importance of seeing these relationships with community as sort of building on existing trust, building more trust, then getting the data, and then continuing to work with partners on how to use that data to help them make the case for the resources they need. So getting a more, a sort of multi-year perspective on the partnerships and how we might authentically be engaged.
Yeah. So someone asked about marketing to students. So, as Bob mentioned, there are some schools that are using Constitution Day to start the conversation. One of the things that we're talking about is sort of inserting some census conversations into, the fall, right? So how do you start folks thinking about why it's important so that when it rolls around in the spring, that they're actually prepared and ready? Another question someone asked, and I don't have the full answer for this, so I can get back to you on this, was will residents on campus housing receive a postcard? And if they lose the postcard, will they still be able to complete the census online? So that is not, I don't actually know that, and we can talk to our folks at the different Census Bureau that we each have contacts with to see if there's an answer. I'm assuming there is a way to still complete the census if you don't have your postcard. Folks on campus are going to be counted in that group quarters that Sherrie was talking about, and so whoever's in charge of data on your campus will, if they haven't already, will very soon be receiving communications from the folks at the census, and they'll be working with them to get those things particularly figured out. So again, as I said, we don't have all the answers. I will certainly look into that because I don't know the answer to that one, but I will look. There was also, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, just from a community college perspective, our campus, and I think probably the majority of community colleges, don't have dorms. So students are moving from their residences and coming onto campus, and some of them are living with their parents and some of them aren't, but they're sort of they're actually infiltrating their own communities, coming back and forth. So we see a sort of different role for educating community college students about the census and how they can take the word back to their own communities, maybe even in their own languages. So marketing can be in multiple languages, and if you have English as a second language programs or students who speak 2-3 languages, they can be a real resource for multicultural marketing.
Yeah.
Another idea for marketing to the students, the Census Bureau has been advertising that they need to hire a lot of people. They need census takers, they need managers, they need data entry folks. So there's an awful lot of positions that are not going to be permanent, but they're great opportunities for students to take advantage of because they do pay very well. And with the unemployment rate so low, the pickings are pretty slim as far as who's available. So if you don't know if that student qualifies for any of those positions, what the Census Bureau is saying, apply. Don't worry about it, just apply. They need bodies. And so it's a great opportunity for them to take advantage of. Plus, then you're getting those trusted voices within the community, because these are students that are familiar with everything in that community. So once they are educated about what's going on, then they can, translate that to the rest of the community.
So there's another question about trainings. And I wasn't sure what trainings we were talking about specifically. So here in Illinois, our plan is that we're going to be doing some specific trainings on community organizing, and we're going to be doing those in person around Illinois with some of our partners. But then we're also going to do some webinars, and I can certainly have those available nationally. But we're working with a partner here in Illinois called the Illinois Civic Missions Coalition to talk about working with K through 12 and how to do this as a civic education opportunity. We're talking to the folks at the United States Hispanic Leadership Institute specifically about that citizenship question and dreamers and how to have that conversation. So we're trying to create some opportunities to learn from community partners who are already thinking about these things. So those will be available on our website, and I certainly can keep folks who are interested updated on how we're doing with that. Also, once we are working with our partners and creating some of this training models, we'll be happy to share that so other folks can do it. And I also want to mention our partners in Minnesota Campus Compact are doing some really fantastic work with some of their faculty and community partners around this as well. So another website to pay attention to. And again, we're going to try and get all of this on the national website, but they've got some great resources available. I would also, as Sherrie mentioned, well, I think we talked about this, certainly try and reach out to a partnership specialist in your area, because those are the folks at the Census Bureau who already know, who are thinking about this and doing this work. There's some really, really great stuff going on already. I know in Illinois, our folks have been working since January of 2018 on getting all of this information together and pulling folks together to have a good conversation. So, if you're just starting to think about it, don't worry. There are other people who have already been thinking about it and who would probably really love to involve your university.
Yep.
Yeah, and similarly, what you're doing, we want to know about. I think we need, we really want to have an iterative discussion about what we're all doing, and great ideas are going to pop up all over the country, and I think we want to have a place to share those ideas. So, look for resources, but also think of your campus and your approaches as resources to this, rather large and important endeavor.
Yeah. So I don't see any other specific questions. Anyone else have anything else they'd like to ask about?
I had heard in the sequence that people would get a card with the website to go to and with a pin to sort of go on the form, to complete the form. And is there an intermediate step where a paper form would be sent to those households, Sherrie? Or is it just go to door to door?
Not at first. The hard to count areas where they don't anticipate folks having computer access, they are going to just automatically get the paper-based form. There may be a follow-up if they don't respond digitally to where they can do the form. I'm not real sure on that one.
Okay, I think that's unclear yet. I think if we could get some clarity about whether there's, online, paper, and door-to-door as a kind of consistent sequence that people might expect. I think that, we'll try to get to the bottom of that. I'm sure my hard to count people here, Eugene Chian in our office probably knows the answer to that. But if there's 3 steps, people ought to know that.
Yeah. So I'm going to hand this back to Marcel, but I do want to say that, our emails are up here. All 3 of us are happy to talk to anyone who has questions or want to kind of engage with us further. As Bob said, it is so important for us to know what is happening elsewhere so we can learn from each other and not reinvent the wheel. So thank you all so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the panelists for sharing your knowledge and experience on the topic of this webinar. And it was truly engaging and meaningful. And for us at Campus Compact, thinking about the way that we can be a hub for these resources to be shared across the country is going to be important. So thank you for the attendees for your participation and engagement. And I want to encourage all of you to make sure that you fill out the evaluation survey that will be in your inbox shortly. It helps provide feedback to our presenters and the committee as we are working towards developing more and engaging webinars in the future. So until next time, thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.